Welcome back. Now, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has chaired a high-level meeting on the situation in Afghanistan. Many have questioned why India, one of Afghanistan's longest-standing allies, has not been vocal enough in its support for the Afghan people. Now, the government has also been criticized for apparently leaving its embassy staff to fend for themselves, although the embassy staff in Kabul have now been evacuated. Neha Poonia has been with us. She is our correspondent, and she joins us now from New Delhi for an update on this situation. Neha, good to speak to you again. So as we wake up here this morning, what is the latest from India? Because just going through some of the papers, looking at the New York Times, talking about India launching an e-visa, but then they also go on to say to the New York Times that this would prioritize the repatriation of Hindus and Sikhs from Afghanistan. But I see that has since been disputed. So please tell us what's happening at the moment in India.
Good morning. We've had finally the government make several statements on how it's viewing the situation in Afghanistan. On Tuesday, after a delay of almost a week, India became one of the last countries in Afghanistan to evacuate its diplomatic staff. You had two special military planes that flew out 140 diplomatic staff and personnel, including the ambassador of India to Afghanistan as well. And we're given to understand through sources that the delay was because it took time, the government says, to convince Taliban officials that were manning 15 checkposts between the Indian embassy in Kabul and the airport to let the convoy through. And finally, those two military planes arrived in Delhi late on Tuesday evening. And following that, Prime Minister Modi held a briefing where he was met with the National Security Advisor of India, the Defence Minister, as well as other senior ministers of his cabinet as well. And we're given to understand that this was a debrief. He was intimated on what had been done on Tuesday with the evacuation process. Remember, there's still many Indians stranded in Afghanistan. We don't know how many. The government says it doesn't have a sense of that number, but it is now actively trying to help those people come back home. It's waiting for the resumption of commercial flights and has now set up a helpline as well. But you're right, the e-visa, the emergency visa that India launched on Tuesday for Afghan nationals was initially praised because it was seen as, a long-standing ally of Afghanistan, trying to help the people in distress. But we've heard in the last 24 hours from several government ministers, and reportedly Prime Minister Modi said this as well, that the priority would be to evacuate Sikh and Hindu nationals from Afghanistan. And there's been a lot of criticism, many people saying that at a time when the country is in distress, you cannot discriminate on the basis of religion. But the government says that every Afghan national who wants to come to India can seek refuge here through this emergency visa for 6 months. But sources say that it is likely that Hindus and Sikhs will be prioritized.
So just on that, you can imagine already criticism that India has received about how the Muslim minority is treated in the country. This would probably give more credence to that sort of criticism, Neha?
Absolutely. And, we've seen this sort of pivot, many foreign experts say, as far as India's foreign policy is concerned. If you remember, 2 years ago, India passed a controversial law which said it would fast-track citizenship to persecuted minorities from the Indian subcontinent, from neighboring countries. But that bill, which has now become a law, left out Muslims from neighboring countries. And back then, we had heard from several government ministers who said that there's a reason behind that. The government believes that many of the neighboring countries, including Afghanistan and Pakistan, are Muslim, which is why these countries and their Muslim residents don't necessarily feel persecuted. But many disagree with that, especially now with what's happening in Taliban. Many would argue that right now the most persecuted minority in the country might be the country's women, and you cannot possibly discriminate on the basis of religion when it comes to a certain group of people being more vulnerable, given what we've seen happen when the Taliban was previously in power. But the government so far not commenting on this officially. But you're right, this is going to become an issue that, the Modi government will face a lot of criticism on going ahead and may have to defend this publicly even.
So we do understand that India has parked some of their C-17 aircraft at the Aini air base in Tajikistan. And do we know how fast those particular spaces are being taken up, how easy or how difficult it is for people to move out of Afghanistan at this point?
The last flights that left Afghanistan and came to Delhi were yesterday, which were the two military planes that had special clearance. We're given to understand that India has been in close touch with US forces who are now in control of the international airport in Kabul. We're given to understand that the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, is also in close touch with his counterpart in the US, Antony Blinken. He spoke to him late on Monday night to try and see how India can start operating commercial flights or even get other planes into Afghanistan to try and evacuate other people who are stranded there. But right now there's no clarity on this. And not just military aircraft, India has also put several planes belonging to the national carrier Air India on standby as well. And we're given to understand that the government is just waiting for a sign which will allow it to send planes immediately to Kabul to try and evacuate as many people on priority as possible.
And just finally, Neha, the feeling on the ground, because it was interesting just reading through some of the social media stories that people were posting and what generally people were saying on the ground about people being evacuated from Afghanistan to India. So if we look at that, what is the feeling? What is the sense that you're getting on the ground?
Well, it's mixed emotions. Initially, there was a lot of criticism for the government not acting swiftly enough, not only to evacuate its own nationals and diplomatic staff, but also Afghan nationals. Every year, thousands of Afghan nationals come to India to study. There are about 2,000 students currently in India. India and Afghanistan also have close military ties. There's currently a contingent of Afghan soldiers here in the country who are training. India has invested heavily in Afghanistan over the last several years. Even helping build the country's parliament, several dams, as well as other development projects, which is why many were questioning why India didn't react swiftly enough. There are many who say that the government is deliberately taking a wait-and-watch policy because it wants to see how the Taliban will behave in the days ahead. But in this process, many critics say the government has left Afghan nationals who've been friends to India for decades to fend for themselves. Similarly, many Indian nationals who are stranded there have been tweeting to the foreign minister, to the Indian government, saying, please get us out of here as quickly as possible. We don't feel safe. It's unclear when they'll be able to come back home. So while there has been praise for the government managing to eventually bring back its diplomatic staff, there are still questions about what happens to the others who are there, what happens to those in Afghanistan who are looking to India for help and are still expecting it in some ways.
Neha Poonia, will have to leave it there. Neha speaking to us from New Delhi this morning, and these are the latest developments, and of course following on from what is happening in Afghanistan, where the Taliban have now taken control of that country. And India, they have, of course, launched that e-visa, and all Indian citizens in Afghanistan are able to take advantage of that. But as you heard there from Neha, some questions being asked about the prioritization process, prioritizing Sikh and Hindu nationals in that process. We'll keep an eye on that one and let you know as things develop.